That being said, I'm going to hand the mic over to Connie. I will let her do the intro, and I'll have her pass. I'll let everyone on the panel introduce themselves. Most of them you know. And with that being said, I'll just pass it over to you. So let's welcome our panelists.
If you guys want to... I don't... Is this on? Okay, yeah. So I'll go ahead and have you all introduce yourselves. So Anthony, if you want to go ahead and get started.
It's been a long time since you guys heard me last speak. But no, Anthony Fisic, I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Battelle.
Hi, I'm Jana Moore. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for North America at Belron International.
I'm Joy Kenyon. I'm the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer at Cardinal Health.
Oh, it's on. I'm Tremayne Smith. Call me Trey. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for Wexner Medical Center at Ohio State.
Go ahead.
And I'm Jay Bobo. I lead product security at CoverMyMeds, which is based here in Columbus, Ohio.
And we have to give Trey a hard time. He's a Michigan fan. Okay, yeah, we're going to kick him off. No, I'm just kidding.
We still love you, Trey.
Yes, we do.
You work at Ohio State, so that makes up for it.
Yeah. So today we're going to actually talk about AI. I know everyone's talking about it, but I thought it would be really great to get all of their perspectives of how they're handling AI in their organizations. And we definitely want questions. So if you have questions, just raise your hands. I think we have a microphone that they're going to pass around because we do have some online people. I'm not sure. Do you have a mic? Okay, perfect. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. All right, so the first question is, how do you balance the innovation of AI and security? Jay, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Wow, right out the gate. A hard question. You know, how do you balance it? I think you have to think about sort of, this is my personal opinion, and I would say, I don't want to speak for our entire organization. You know, we treat AI like other sort of emerging technologies, right? So, you know, in most cases, I think we would all agree that the controls are the same, right? And we kind of know we'll talk more about the dangers, you know, later on. But we have to make sure that we have that balance. Again, if we're looking at AI for emerging products, which in our case is kind of the way we look at it, how are we making sure that we're providing what, you know, we're covering the needs of our patients and our clients while we're not being, you know, we're not being so stringent to say, hey, let's throw every security control at this because of our fear, right? Because of fear. And so, you know, that's one of the things that you hear me talk a lot about. It's like getting back to sort of the human and the emotion side of these things as opposed to just focusing on the technology, recognizing that we have fear of the unknown. All right, let's look at how we have thought through controls and security for other sort of really disruptive technologies. And that's kind of the way we're looking at it, is making sure we have some sort of balance.
Joy?
So I think that it's really funny that you asked me this question because prior to my life in security, I actually did a multi-year stint in data and analytics at Cardinal Health. So I know what it's like to be on the other side and want to run fast at innovation. But I also know, you know, where the bodies are buried and may have buried a few myself. So, you know, balancing that with security is obviously of the utmost importance. And, you know, with that, I would say how we balance it, education, first and foremost, is paramount. We need to help our business to not only understand the possibilities, but understand the risks. So helping to educate them right out of the gate, but then also providing them with a safe space to innovate. So one of the things that we're doing at Cardinal Health is working to stand up our AI garden, which does give our business that opportunity to start tinkering, you know, building to a minimal viable product, but ensuring that we have the right controls in place to make it safe for them to innovate.
Trey?
It's a juggling act right now. It's so being a teaching hospital, having a large research presence, everyone definitely wants to move fast. We don't know what we don't know, but to Jay's point, most of the controls don't necessarily change. We've created some policies and guidelines, working with legal services closely, just so if we make a mistake, we're making some informed decisions about it, managing risk as best we can. Education's a big deal. We try to understand the use case that the individuals really want to pursue, like what are your goals, what are you trying to achieve? Are there ways for us to do it with through a Microsoft solution that we manage, or do you have to try something that's a little bit outside of our control spectrum, but at the same time, we understand what it is you're trying to achieve, and as long as you stay within those kind of guardrails, we'll accept the risk, for lack of a better term.
Jana?
I think for us, I mean, they're basically hitting on all the points that I would also agree with. I would add that at our company, we're really trying to make security part of the business discussion and the conversation. So it's not just about security versus the business or vice versa, that it's let's talk about what the value is in doing this as a company, and then how do we enable that. And so we're embracing it at Belron and just trying to provide them a safe place to innovate, making sure that there's education and guidelines and all of those things too. But that's how we're approaching it.
Well, you know, they've pretty much covered everything, but I do want, I asked to be the last person on every question. But no, I think the other thing I'd like to highlight, you know, as we talk about all these great points, but, you know, IT security, we're all one organization. So the other part of this, IT has to be ready to support and deliver these initiatives, right? So even if security is flexible, we're not the chief no officer, right? It's all about risk. If we don't have the support structures, the innovation garden, the guidelines or the pathways as simple as processing tickets to get people to, let's ask the right people if you have an idea to get you to the right tool, we're doing our business, the business side of the house a disservice. So IT as a whole has to be ready. We're part of that. We have security, but you know, we're also part of the ITIL process and making sure that we can deliver these services seamlessly and support that business.
So I'll pick on you on the next question. You get to go first.
Can I add something really quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because there's also education just within IT and within security, because AI is such a big term. So someone using ChatGPT just to help craft an email, like, do we have to spin up a system just to support that? Are we okay if you just run your response to a business partner through that particular engine and get a more concise message? Are we okay with that? I mean, if we educate them, then we're saying if you're using that for that purpose, no big deal. You're not putting sensitive information out there. Just be careful not to do that. If we're doing something with Azure AI services or something on that level, totally different conversation. But oftentimes when you're having that conversation to start with, people are coming to the table with just that very ambiguous, I want to use AI. Is it okay? Like that's not a quick conversation over a cup of coffee.
And I think we've talked a lot about where, I mean, I think in security sometimes we want to be the people that are saying no, no, no. And I mean, AI, we're not going to stop it. BYOD, people are going to do it on their laptops. So one of the things I just want to get your opinion on is, in my opinion, like the guardrails and governance around AI. And just like any other technology, you have to understand what that's going to look like. From a business perspective, not allowing people to use AI, you could lose market share, you can lose productivity. And as much as we in security wish that we could always have the final say, if the business wants to do something, we have to figure out how to do that. So, Anthony, do you have any thoughts on that with the guardrails and?
Yes, and I think that as we're all tracking IT and developments, but I think I can speak from experience, in regard to at least Battelle. We knew about it, but we were kind of caught off guard initially. And our first response was block it, stop. But then we paused and thought, because we're primarily a research organization. How do we flip this and then start to provide those guidelines, list out obviously key criteria, no proprietary data. I'm not going to go down that list. But one thing I'd like to call out is we start to use these from a research perspective, business perspective, email. As we look at it, we're a very litigious society, and we have to be careful about what we produce and, the output of ChatGPT and trusting those things. So, and as we look at it from our perspective at Battelle, as we start to engage in research projects and these, we almost, we have to validate the data on the output, garbage in, garbage out. But, some customers could have, they're paying for real people to analyze and give results. So there has to be some intellectual honesty in there and trying to find a balance of how much do we disclose, how much of this came from an AI process is regurgitating old work, because everybody thinks their service is for them and it's novel and it's just, and we have to, either through the sales pipeline, through intellectual honesty and making sure we run it through the right legal processes and have the proper disclosure so we don't put our organizations in legal jeopardy.
Jana?
So that's part of those guidelines. But yeah.
I think some of the guidelines that we're thinking about is first, when we're talking about generative AI, for just in this example, in terms of predictive AI and machine learning, those are things that we've been doing over the years with our data scientists. But with generative AI, it's all about the type of data, making sure that, again, what Anthony was just saying about what data you're disclosing, whether it's in a public, versus private engine. What is your use case? How are you protecting our, proprietary or sensitive data? It's also about, I would say the ethics conversation around AI too. Biases, making sure there's a human involved in any decision making. So it kind of goes along those lines of making sure that we're having the right oversight from a people standpoint, a legal standpoint, and that it's not inadvertently informing decisions that we wouldn't have made on our own as humans. So,
Joy.
Yeah, I think especially, we touched a lot on the data points. It'll be interesting to see from a regulatory perspective what new regulations come about in this space, especially being able to demonstrate how you arrived at certain outputs from generative AI. I mean, that's kind of the whole point, right? Like, we don't know what's going on inside that black box. And when we have to audit that, that's going to get real tricky, right? So how do we have the right controls in place to be able to follow that trail? And then, in that same regard, thinking through just from like a overall policy controls and standards, do the standards that we have in place today fit with this new capability, with this new technology? And that's certainly something that we are looking at, because we may need to look at how we implement protections in a different way in order to ensure that we're protecting our outcomes.
And they pretty much covered everything before it got to me again.
Ditto.
But as Anthony said, like the litigious side of it, if some of you are not familiar, there was a Metapixel lawsuit against a lot of healthcare institutions where we were inadvertently putting information potentially into Facebook. And those are things that we have to think about. So even though you're using these open AI and other types of AI engines, what are the potential unintended consequences if patient information ends up there, or other sensitive information based on the industry that you're in? And that's not necessarily for the cybersecurity experts to say no to. It's for the organization to understand the risk, understand that there may be a very similar set of circumstances to Metapixel, and how might the organization deal with that if that ends up being the case.
Great points. I agree with all of them. I think I think one thing that I would point out, so at CoverMyMeds, we are the software technology portion of McKesson. So that includes companies like the actual startup CoverMyMeds that was started here, Relay Health, RX Crossroads, and others. So we're one of the largest business associates here in the U.S. And so one of the things that's really interesting to us about generative AI and these various LLM models is that data cannot be perfectly anonymous and also useful. You have to kind of pick. And the issue with generative AI fundamentally is that in order for you to have something that's meaningful when it comes to actually utilizing that, is that you have to feed it production data, right, in most cases. And that's something I think we need to talk about more. And so just recently when Microsoft had a breach, right, tied to its use of AI for exactly this particular reason. So I think making sure we have the same controls in place for this stuff on the generative AI side. I think as we start talking about sort of what is the impact on AI on people and ethics and stuff like that, I think we can really look at what's happening with algorithmic trading, which has been around forever. How do we go through and hedge some of these bets to a certain degree? But the big thing that we all should be thinking about when we go back to work, when we go back to work from here, right, is just to think about how are we utilizing this data for our own models, where your emerging products teams and other folks are attempting to utilize this stuff. Okay, great. Are we using synthetic data? If so, then you may not necessarily be able to have the impact that you want to have in the marketplace. If we use production data, well, okay, great, using that, but again, do we have the controls in place and make sure that we don't end up in a situation like Microsoft did just recently?
So this is kind of off script, so sorry guys, but as we're talking about like the bias and things like that, I was actually at a conference a couple weeks ago in Cincinnati on an AI panel, And one of the CISOs was basically saying that when people are applying for jobs, they're using AI to match their resume exactly with the job description. So as hiring managers, I think that's a huge thing with bias. Like if we're just looking solely at that, and what they're finding is they bring these people in and they're not qualified because it's just obviously made from AI. So have any of you seen that? And how are you kind of like taking that into consideration as you're bringing in people to interview? Go ahead, Jana.
So I can chime in. So actually, we just went through this exercise where we brought in a tool that does exactly what you're talking about. And so it went through a rigorous legal discussion on, okay, how can we bring this tool in to perform what we need it to kind of cut down on the volume of applicants that are coming in for these jobs, which is a good thing. But then what kind of safety nets do we need to put in place and review process quarterly so that we can prove that there is rigor around how are we looking at the training data, how are we making sure it's not biasing any of its recommendations on candidates. And so we have to provide evidence to that. So we've aligned with our legal team on a process quarterly to review and look at the decision making that's coming out of the tool, and that all decisions ultimately have to happen with a human, right? So I mean there is that human involvement, but we still have to go back and look at the data and make sure that we're not just getting one certain type of candidate based on the training data put into the tool. And so there was a lot of back and forth with the vendor about what data are you using to train this model so that we can determine whether or not it's fair and ethical and equitable for all. So we just went through this. Yeah.
Have you? Okay.
So I know we've been speaking broadly about this, but I just want to add one point we haven't called out explicitly. So there are open models, and if you're using your business data, use a closed model that's not going to feed the machine on the background, right? So as we're talking about putting HR data in this, you can create your own independent instance using these. It costs more, but you're not feeding the back end with whoever the validators are, China, whoever's on the back end, and all these people around the world that are validating or shaping data or fuzzing it to get to a certain outcome. Make sure you preserve that so as we go through these validation steps, we're not just trying to catch a butterfly, 10 butterflies. They're all over the place. So that's the only thing I call out. Ensure you're protecting your back end, and if you're feeding your own data into that model, once again, make sure it's completely isolated and protected so you're not dumping all your crown jewels into the ChatGPT-4.
Yeah, and that's also a good question to ask of your vendors. I mean, that's the first thing they say. We use AI. What is it doing on the back end? Are you contractually signing your data over to them to use for different purposes that you would not have knowingly done, unless you review the contracts?
Well, we talked about it in the first one, but does everyone recall what happened with Zoom? Like literally within like a couple hours, all these big companies were canceling because they were basically taking all of the data from your Zoom meetings and feeding it into the engines. And obviously with Zoom meetings with remote work, there's confidential conversations. So they fixed that pretty quick. But I mean, like everything you think about, like all the browsers, I mean, everything you open like automatically starts AI. And so what are those guardrails and controls? And I think we talked a little bit about how training and development, and I think for me, what I see is like, a lot of people in security have more of a infrastructure background, and so the conversations between app developers and the infrastructure, they don't speak the same language, and AI is the same way. And so I think when you're looking at AI, you need to train security people how AI works. They don't need to be experts, but if they understand beyond just the simple definitions, I think the output of what we're going to get from them from both sides is going to be better, and it's going to be more aligned with the business. So obviously AI is taking, I feel like every vendor says they do machine learning, AI. I think there's a lot of amazing things are going to happen, especially like with threat intel at your security operations centers. So can you all talk a little bit at a high level how you're seeing that change from like someone have to manually go through 10,000 logs a minute or whatever. But Jay, do you want to go ahead and start with that?
Yeah, so this has come up. I mean, all the time, right? Who's not selling AI, ML, right? It's in everybody's marketing material. I think what's interesting is what we found. I was talking to Reagan and Avon about this because you just had a securing AI workshop, and we were talking about that there's this concept in the DeFi sort of crypto world where they have a object called an oracle, right? And the oracle's responsibility is to go through and actually validate these transactions. And fundamentally, that's kind of what we're missing, I think, on the AI side. So when we talk about, hey, what am I getting with, threat intel? Or, I know there's been a lot of talk about utilizing AI for third-party risk management to help with, validating and going through sort of assessments as well. What we're finding out is that we still need that human element. We need that oracle. We need that sort of validation that's not there currently. And I think that's kind of what we're going to need to really see sort of the outcomes that we want to see. Another good example is that there's a friend of mine, a guy by the name of Salman Khan, who's created ask your kids about it. It's called Khan Academy. And they have this, they were one of the first folks to adopt GPT-4. And one of the things that's really interesting in the way that they utilize it is that you have a tutor, right, an AI tutor who assists your kid with math and other STEM sort of things. But the teacher is also a part of that conversation to be there and to validate. So even in that particular use case, which is absolutely phenomenal to see what kids are getting out of what they call Conmigo, there still is a teacher, there's a validator, there's an oracle there to make sure that when it starts hallucinating, right, we can do. So I think we're going to need the exact same thing to really get some true value out of what vendors have been selling us on the AI side.
You looked at me, so I guess it's me. Like Mark, I can talk, but so I think we're, if we think about the vendor space, it's just a commodity, right? But I think what we're doing here is trying to use it to optimize what we have. There's gaps between security tools. How do we do things better? Whether that's, validating a manual process. Hey, a VLAN popped up, or hey, new devices showed up. Using AI, working with our inventory tool to identify if these things have the proper agents on them, whether it's your, I don't want to use a brand name, so I'm pausing. An EDR tool or your vulnerability management tool or agent. So using it to check out, hey, and it's particularly important for us in ICS systems as, we're trying to keep hygiene on certain VLANs. It's also very important so we can run these things. And we've also used it to accelerate things like writing PowerShell scripts. Sure, we can write one. It'll probably be that long. But, we can get, GPT or some sort of AI engine to write that for us, a generative AI engine. It really streamlines on efficiency. And I had one last use case that I lost. Well, for instance, and I just remember because I looked at Misty, she's my governance manager there. So as part of compliance, there are last minute requirements. We had 200 plus documents we had to submit. So we're one of the 20 organizations in the whole world that have passed our JVSA Joint DibCap walkthrough. You probably don't know what that means, and I'm happy for you. But it's CMMC level 2. We have a secure enclave. But it's last minute the DoD said, or the DibCac said, hey, on every one of these 200 documents of varying types and formats, we want you to put a disclosure statement so it doesn't leak in a FOI. So instead of spending lots of hours, and Misty probably killing me later, we used ChatGPT. Rob came up with a script to do it all in like 2 minutes, right? So we spent an hour playing around. We did it all in 2 minutes. So even those small efficiencies, they're not massive. I call them small. I know that. It's kind of redundant. But, these little things we can do. And as it evolves and our use cases evolves, we'll start to expand these, whether it's threat hunting a little bit better, taking the manual processes out. But I think truly it's that integration. And, we have a science and technology committee at Battelle that's also fully researching these, whether it's on sales or contract writing and all that. I think that's the value, right? Do we have 12 people doing something? Can it be 3 and they just validate, right? So outside of security, I think, as everybody knows, there's plenty of use cases, but focusing on that security use case, I think we're just filling the gaps between tools and accelerating things that would typically be manual. I haven't really seen, I'm sure they're out there, I'm sure somebody's done something cool, but from my perspective, I'm sure you guys will share, it's not there yet.
Yeah, I would agree. I think right now for us, we're dabbling with what we can do to automate some manual processes, maybe like feeding it in to help us write some Python scripts better or something like that. Jeremy, who's here with me today, we actually had that conversation about how we can do things a little bit faster and more efficient. I think the indicator of attack is an interesting opportunity. Rather than IOCs, look at the IOAs and how can you start to kind of do more real-time analysis on what are some of the behaviors that you start to see in your environment before it becomes a full-blown compromise. So starting to pay attention to kind of the early indicators, if you will. And working with your partners. I mean, you have partners who, they all say they have AI, ML, and all these capabilities. Exploit that, work with them and try to make that more valuable for yourself, and really partner on, okay, what are we doing to innovate together? Put that in your contracts, that there's an innovation clause, that you require them to meet. I think there's some interesting things that you can do there as your acumen raises. As an internal team, you can then lean a little harder on your vendors and partners to work with you on that and developing. So you don't have to make it all, from scratch, right? You can take advantage of your investments.
I have virtual questions.
Okay.
First one is from Kavitha Bangalore. How many AI-based tools are you using in your environment? Considering the speed at which offenders are using AI to attack systems, are you using AI to attack their systems?
No, we're not offensive.
Yeah.
Not doing anything offensive at this point, just defensive.
It's Connie's language.
Yeah, and you might get in a little bit of trouble if you do that too. There might be some laws you might be breaking on that, but I mean, our government can do that, but.
I have one more from Todd Comer. It would be interesting to know approach on standards policies related to AI. Have any of the panelists seen real impact of published guidelines that have kept this in check? Or is the environment around AI just too in flux at the moment to keep up with that type of governance?
I'd say both. Hi, Todd Comer. I'm not surprised that's a question from Todd. No, I think that's a great question. I think both. So I think the guidelines that we've put in place, we've also stood up a working group, an AI working group. It's kind of the front door team that you can meet with on a monthly basis to bring your ideas to use as kind of your local experts, to pressure test your ideas to see if it's going to fly within our guidelines. And so we're giving them opportunities to kind of review the guidelines, come to us, let's review it together, and let's see if this is going to work. But then both, I say that because it's also kind of in flux and there's a lot happening and there's pockets of innovation going on that we might not be aware of, shadow IT type things. So I'd say that we are seeing some success, but it's hard to get your arms around it.
Yeah, I'd say we're exactly the same. So when you come through the legitimate front door, we have it embedded into our risk assessment processes. We also have a similar sub-working group that can go and do some things with our enterprise architecture teams to make sure it's going to work. But from a discovery perspective, we didn't do any hard stops, so there's a chance that there are other activities we're just not aware of.
Yeah, one of the things that we're doing is we put in place a cross-functional review board for all of our AI use cases. So we do have lenses from legal, privacy, security, IT, all at the table, helping to review the types of controls and standards that do need to be implemented around a particular use case. And I would say to Todd's question, today we're finding that most of our standards have met the needs of the particular use case, but I could see where our use cases do become much more sophisticated, that we just don't have the right standards in place, and we may need to consider, new patterns, especially when you get into the more sophisticated vector databases. You're looking at RBAC within a vector database. It's much different than, some of the standard patterns that we have in place today. So I could see it's going to quickly evolve, and we're doing our best to stay in front of it.
Yeah, I would echo that and then go back to the point that was mentioned earlier about education. One of the first things that we did was to really stand up a community of practice and have, folks from my product security team and have legal in the room, and then a lot of our engineers and product owners from emerging products in the room so we could sort of have these conversations, about policies and standards and frameworks. And what we found is that, a lot of the stuff we already have, and the controls we have in place, we just need to make sure that we're doing them for this new tech, right, and these new products. What we have found that's been super helpful is, again, is reaching out to people who have already been in this space. Going back, I got to mention Reagan again because she's awesome. Is that not a lot of these are actually moving into production. So like less than 1%, I think is what the number that she mentioned. Mm-hmm. So again, it's kind of like everybody's sometimes, not everyone, but a lot of folks are very fearful, and there's a lot of conversation about some of the stuff. When we talk about sort of what's actually rolling out, where we're building on our own sort of closed models, maybe even leveraging open models, and creating products for those, there's not really a whole lot out there, it feels like. So I think that's one thing. And then the other thing I just mentioned too is that OWASP has put out some really great stuff. If you're looking for something for your software engineers or product owners even, their framework, it's like top 10 for AI, and there's a much more lengthier document that's out there. It's been super helpful for us, and I would recommend it to others too.
And they have a relatively new one on large language models too.
Yes.
On the OS side.
Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
Well, and I think they actually just came out with an AI one like the last couple weeks. So it's relatively new, yeah. All right, so I was going to just see if each of you could give some of examples of what you're doing to mitigate the risk of AI. Who wants to go first? Anthony.
Sort of always comes to me, I guess. No, I think we've covered a lot. I mean, it's really about, we've talked about guidelines, not every, technical controls, not so much. But I think it's about giving, having that open dialogue with the business, the employees, and making sure there's a conduit for the right way, right? You can't say no without an option to do the right thing. So it's about awareness, communication, and I think everybody's gone through in detail some of the things that we're doing, but it's really about the right thing, corporate culture, following the rules. We don't want to slow you down, but just jump through these hoops or share your case through a review, and we'll get you there, and we're going to see if there's a business value or not if it's IT hard or security's hard, or we're going to see if there's a value there. And I think, at least from what I've seen and what I hear, that's resonating with the staff in our organizations.
I would say one of the things that we're trying to do is look at ways we can share the risk and spread that risk around. So, we talk about leveraging our partners. When we go through our process to get something to a minimal viable product, we do evaluate that business case to say, is this something that we really should be building in-house, or could we lean on a partner? And that's not only just the cost of what it takes to build and train and maintain a model, because it is very expensive. But it's also about the risk. Do we have the right tools in place to best secure this? Or could we leverage a partner where through really tight contracts, we're sharing a little bit of that risk? And so that is something that we're looking at as we start to bring MVP to production as part of our pipeline.
Nothing to add.
Yeah, I would say, so I agree with that completely. And that's one of the things I'm always talking to, my team about and other teams. Let's go back to the fundamentals. Right? Let's talk about risk. Let's talk about what the impact is, right? What the likelihood, of that risk actually occurring. And if we go back and we think about, again, the Microsoft situation, we're talking about 38 terabytes of data. Now, I can't speak for everybody. For me, I'm in healthcare security. So I'm thinking about how much PHI, right? And I know that 83 million records in the case of the Anthem breach, that impact on that company was $500 million, right? So that's something that I'm thinking about. It's something that I'm having that conversation with my senior leaders about. Is this a risk that we care about? $500 million? Yeah. So when we think about AI, I think we really have to get back to brass tacks. How much data are we playing with, and do we have the right controls in place for that? Otherwise, again, not to, can I say beat a dead horse? Is that politically correct? I don't know. But, the situation is that we really have to do something about that. We have to think about this data and then look at what's going to be the impact, financial impact to our business, to shareholders, and to patients in my particular case.
So you go ahead.
Yeah, real quick, if I could. So real high level, that's what we were covering just now. I agree with everything you were saying. I think from more of a technical standpoint, to mitigate some of the risk, giving the opportunity for like a safe kind of sandbox environment, so that we can build up that muscle of how to use AI safely and learn what it means to have governance around. But also with the data, it's all about the data. I mean, it's like going back to the basics with data governance, and how are you tagging your data? Do you know what the data is that you're using? And how do you enable your staff to know what sort of data that they're using in to train the models? And is it tagged properly, right? So I think that's a basic that we all miss. And it's something that we need to think about.
Okay. Do you have anything else? Okay. So we'll open it up for questions. So does anyone have questions? And I think we have a microphone coming. Oh, perfect.
Hello. I was curious what the tenure of a CISO is with the level of stress you guys have, and it's an honest question, and the fact that
It should be told by all the gray
the fact
hairs
that if
we
you do
have,
have
right?
if you do have a big breach that you could be let go. I mean, what's the typical tenure of a CISO?
I don't know. I think the industry average is 18 to 24 months.
Yeah.
But why, here's another angle to that. If you have a big breach, why would you let that CISO go? Because you're letting all that learning and experience just walk out your door? Right, right. So
I think that goes to the core issue here of communicating effectively to leadership and making sure everybody understands the risk in the context of the business. So it's not, I'm firing the CISO, it's like, oh, we made a risk decision. No, you still may get punted out, but there's risks of losing that experience, and it's kind of an intellectually dishonest process if you're going to do that. But I think that most organizations, I believe, based on my experience, they're pretty mature in that regard, as long as everybody's doing the right thing. And I mean, nobody's 100% sure about anything, right? So I think that as the world's evolved, as boards have evolved, and senior leadership's evolved, I guess we're more hip to the jive, and they get it. And it's not just throw out the, show my age a
I know
bit,
we're full of them today.
Yeah, they're throwing a baby out with the, nobody's throwing out, I haven't, the baby out, I'm really full. Nail jello to a tree, I got them all. I was in the army. All right.
Do you-
what I heard you say in that, Anthony, was you're going to delegate the stress, spread it around.
Raise it up.
Yeah.
There's a CRO that I can
And I was going to say the exact same thing. Is building out your team. Like, they help with the stress. It is sharing the responsibility. Create as much governance as you can. You're informing the governance groups. You're not actually owning the decision. Again, it doesn't mean you're not going to get thrown out with the bathwater, but it's the way you can build your resiliency. For my team, I've been there a long time at Ohio State. It's been nearly 20 years. But go blue. My people in the corner, go blue. They slept on me. But it's a great place to work. It's absolutely a great place to work. So
The last 25 years has been a little hard for you, hasn't it? Only 2 times or 3 times in.
I got recency bias. I'm talking about
I
last
know.
year.
Yeah, of course.
But seriously, Ohio State has invested in the security program over time, the medical center. So as I've been growing and stressing and had hair like Jay when I started, now my team's larger, so it's tolerable.
Jay. Any other questions?
Thank you. When people say AI, the first use case comes to people's mind is a GPT. But the question is about AI in general. What do you guys think is unique about the risks introduced by AI and that is different from any other emerging technology or any other new IT thing?
If I can start, I don't think there's that much more increased risk. If there are better phishing lures that individuals can create, I mean, smart people can do that on their own. They can just create them faster and more effectively with AI. But that's not necessarily, again, unique to AI. A group of bad actors can hire 1 million people to do it for them, and we probably get the same results. So I've been trying to educate folks that, like Jay's saying, back to the basics, like, where are you putting your data? Is your data leaving the environment? Then you've already got controls in that space. Or if it's in an environment you can't trust and don't understand the controls in that environment, it's not the why you put it there, it's the fact that it's there. And if it's there because of AI, that didn't change the conversation for me. So we've been having a lot of conversations like that, and like I said earlier, trying to get out of that very nebulous AI just discussion. It's like, no, what are your use cases? What are you trying to accomplish? Can we do it in-house? Is it something we have to do tomorrow, or can we take some time to think about it? And oftentimes, from a security perspective, we're put under the pressure of, we need to do it right now, right? And because AI is that buzzword, it's like, we don't want to fall behind the curve, so hurry up and do it. So to me, the risk comes out of rushing into something and not paying attention to it. So again, back to what Jay has said, and get back to the block and tackling and doing it well, and it's about the best we can do.
And I think we talked a little bit about this earlier where, to me, I'm old enough, when I first started in IT, not everyone had a desktop. And then, oh my God, we had laptops. And then remember the world was like, oh my God, we're letting these devices out of our, and now we have these, which I can say my first computer was way less power than this is. And so I think that basics is like, we're never gonna stop technology. We're never gonna stop advancement. So you have to figure out what you're going to do. And I think some of the frameworks and the guardrails, they really apply, in my opinion, across all the technology. I don't know if you guys agree with that or not, but I just think that we can't get scared about technology. Because, I mean, if you think the evolution of, like, in the late 90s, 2000, how many people actually even had websites? So it's like, think about, in such a short period of time, we've evolved from a IT and security, like tenfold. And so as security people, if we're always chasing that new innovation, we're going to literally, for some of us that have hair and some of us don't. But I just think you have to figure out what that's going to look like from that perspective.
I will say that like very similar to SaaS models or other ways of having shadow IT, AI can accelerate the mistakes that people can make. Right, so once it's in the hands of a novice business unit and they're trying to do something rapidly, they can make a bigger mistake with just the access to that type of powerful technologies.
Do you have it? Okay. And I think there was a question back.
I was going to say something really quickly. Just something that you mentioned earlier. I think, from a business context, I feel pretty good. I think what scares me is more of the societal stuff. And you were talking about earlier in a separate room about the impact of sort of deep fakes, at scale. And so it's really interesting that I think that we have sort of the head of OpenAI is also working on WorldCoin, which I don't know if everyone's familiar with this. It's this orb that you use to scan your iris to prove that you're a human, right? And so, and they're paying people in other countries, right, to go out and scan their iris, right, at scale. And so I think it's really interesting about what does it mean to prove that you are you moving forward, especially and I think especially look at like social media, right? What's the impact of social media, misinformation, disinformation, just over the last 5 years? We recognize that we need more controls there. So I think, get into some of the points there. It's going to be interesting, I think. It's going to be really, really, there are interesting times right now, and I think seeing how regulators respond to this 7 years down the road, after we've already had a very human impact, I think it's going to be interesting. So, that's my 2 cents.
My question was more focusing on several of you guys have mentioned the idea of training on AI models and sharing validation with partners. But with it being a new technology, have you actually sat down and talked about how we as an industry can actually create that widespread validation process that we can actually agree on, like this is probably the proper way to actually go out and validate? And is that something that we're working towards as an industry or just as individual silos, and we're hoping that they'll merge at some point?
Yeah, and admittedly, I haven't looked at the OWASP guidance, so maybe there is, if anyone has deeper insights into that in particular, but I haven't seen anything industry-wide around, recommendations for a validation pathway. I would imagine, though, that would have to come pretty quickly as regulation evolves. But yeah, I think we're all trying to figure it out collectively, and so something like that would certainly be helpful.
I agree, and I don't know if you heard, I think OWASP came with some ideas, and was mentioned earlier, and I think I just saw something from NIST. Maybe it was a draft.
Yeah, NIST has something,
So these are obviously rapidly evolving, but those have come out, and nobody's read them yet, so we'll let you know tomorrow. Meet you here.
That's right.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I've got one real quick. Mine is around, we've talked a little bit about data loss and some of the challenges around that potentially, but what about regulatory impact from, a lot of us maybe aren't international, but like GDPR or California's regulation, where we're only allowed to use data for its intended purpose that the customer signed off on. But in the case of generative AI, if we are feeding that data to the AI model, it's going to be used potentially as training data. And so would that be out of compliance then with those regulations?
Yeah, well, I would say, you get consent. So as part of that process, if you're going to start to use new data, I mean, if you're thinking GDPR or otherwise, that data is going to get stale anyway, and you're going to have to get rid of it. So as you onboard new customers, regardless of the product or approach, as part of that agreement, you work it in there, or even explicitly, whether it's on a web page. I mean, there's tons of challenges around there, especially that it's, I'm sure Schrems will have something to say. I'm sure, you know, the EU and the Commission will have something to say as well. But I think that's how you go. It's always about consent up front and not using data you don't have consent on, or refreshing that consent with those, regardless, I guess, of approach. And obviously there's HIPAA and other kind of weirdness that, you know, each industry have their own things, but consent's always the key from my perspective. You can't go wrong getting that.
Right, and I was going to add to, like the Metapixel lawsuits I mentioned earlier, informed consent in healthcare is very specific. So just having some long dictionary of things that you might do is not acceptable from like a patient's perspective. You have to inform them specifically about what you're going to do. So it will be a challenge for us to make sure we don't fall into some trap that sets us up for lawsuits in the future.
When you mention informed consent, that kind of brings up, I mean, in the health district it's different, but if you consent to 100 pages of whatever Microsoft said you consented to, you don't know if you gave your firstborn or not. And most people do not read something that's more than 3 pages.
That's why there are 100 pages.
Yeah.
Yes.
If you ever read your internet provider's thing, you have no right to privacy. So.
Well, and I did have an AI question. I've used AI a couple times to help me with scripts and programming and even write a short story. And when you guys talked at first, the first question was using AI to make decisions instead of humans, it seemed like. And I know Cigna is being class action sued for 49% denials based on an AI model, and insurance companies are wanting to keep more money than they give. And so how do you, is it going to be, I see a bunch of regulations coming or more lawsuits coming the more we find out that more AI is making decisions for humans. Is that going to be necessary? Or even the data that they sample, we don't know if it's unknown biased or not from previous claims.
They're going to have to write AI to check the AI. I
Exactly.
mean,
Reagan says that.
No, I think you mentioned it earlier, right? Or was it Anthony? They were talking about having a human on the tail end of what that decision was. So, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we're ever going to be able to get away from human in the loop.
I
That's
No hire, fire, you know.
right. Human has to be in the loop.
But I think from a positive perspective, when you, like I write a lot of articles and things like that, and sometimes my brain is just so overwhelmed. I have thoughts, but I can't put them on paper or type. And I'll put something in ChatGPT, and it helps me formulate my thoughts very quickly. So I think that, and that's where I think most of us, like by show of hands, does anyone really like to look at logs 24/7 and trying to find the needle in the haystack? So for me, AI on the security side is if we can have our teams look at what really matters versus all of this clutter and everything else. I think that's where the human part comes in, so we can be more productive and then, quite frankly, work on things that are more important to us as individuals as well as to companies. So that's just kind of some of the thoughts. Because I will say, when I first thought about AI and we have the shortage that we have, I'm like, oh my God, are we going to eliminate, you know, all of the entry-level jobs? And what I thought about more is that we aren't going to, because we can actually probably bring people in with less experience and just train them on models and in kind of looking at problem solving and critical thinking. And so we might even be able to retain our security operations centers way longer if they're focused on the, you know, kind of cool things versus just looking at logs every day.
I think one thing that we haven't talked about, and it goes to what Anthony was saying earlier about the getting consent from the consumers to use their data. It's what do you do when you've used their data to train your model, and then you get a request from them to be forgotten or delete. I want you to delete my data. That's going to be very hard to pull that out of your models, especially if you share them on a public, right? And so I think that's a conversation we haven't even got into yet, that we're talking about internally with our legal team of what does that mean when we get those requests from California, right?
I want to go back to the making folks more efficient and more productive. I think it's something we should also be careful with. So if you have a lot of logs and needle in a haystack and you turn on the filter and it lets out just enough. Then you've got managers who just keep turning it up, like till the person has no time to walk away. Like everything becomes important. So even though it was 1 million log entries to look at, and you got it down to 100 a day, let me see if I can turn it up to 125 or 150. Like just being careful with what we're defining as important and making sure we're maintaining a good work-life balance for our teams.
The human side of things. Yeah. Anyone else? Well, thanks for the participation. We appreciate you guys staying and listening. And I know we're like determining when you can leave. So if no one has any other questions, thanks for everyone for joining us.